In the last lecture, we talked about heuristics, those mental shortcuts that we use to help us make decisions. It does sacrifice a little bit of accuracy, but it can save us a lot of effort. And that tied into this question of how rational are human beings? We entertain the idea that maybe we are rational in a bounded sense. We are boundedly rational. We are making the most rational decisions that we can within certain constraints. We don't want to spend too much effort or too much time. That may actually result in more negative outcomes than just sacrificing a little bit of accuracy by using heuristics. But I want to dive into a little more detail about exactly how rational we are, and we'll look at it in a very limited context. We're going to look at it in the context of logic, formal logic. How do we evaluate logical expressions? How logical are human beings? All right, first of all, what is logic? Let's talk about propositional logic. If you've taken a logic class, this will be very familiar. Propositional logic is a way of representing ideas to test their validity. So it's all about form. Propositional logic is all about the form of an argument, not about the content of an argument. It's just about the form. It's sort of like a math for language. Logic in this context doesn't mean emotionless. It's not the Spock type of logic.
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
It means operating by formal logical principles. It means having well-formed expressions. We can think of well-formedness in logic as being sort of like well-formedness in language, in syntax. Remember, we have grammatical and ungrammatical sentences. We have a similar concept in logic. Things can be valid or invalid. It's very much like grammatical and ingrammatical. And we can see whether an argument is valid or not without caring at all about whether the individual propositions are true or false. It doesn't matter. It's the same way that we can see if a sentence is syntactically well-formed, if it's grammatical, without caring about its semantics. And Chomsky has those example sentences like colorless green ideas sleep furiously. It doesn't make any sense. It has no real semantic content, or at least the semantic content is just contradictory and nonsensical. But it's syntactically well-formed. We're going to see something very similar with logic. Logic has its own internal set of rules and principles about how an argument can be structured. What is a valid argument? It sort of governs reasoning. What is valid reasoning in logical terms? As the name suggests, propositional logic consists of propositions and logical operators. A proposition is just a statement. So if I say something like, it's raining, I'm a human, I did all of my homework, those are all propositions. They're just statements about things in the world. There's also a small set of logical operators that modify and connect propositions. And what logic is, it's a way of performing computations on propositions to determine their truth values. So these logical operators, what they do is they take propositions as their arguments, and they modify how we assess the truth of those arguments. So a logical operator like and, you can have this and that, one proposition and the other. It's raining and I did my homework. For and to be true, both of the propositions must be true. And then we have a logical operator like or is like and. It takes two things and joins them together. But it's a little bit different. In order for the or expression to be true, one or both of those arguments can be true. But at least one must be true. If both of them are false, then the or proposition is false. Not is a little bit wacky. All it does is invert the truth value. So I take a proposition like it is raining. Well, that proposition is true if there is rain falling outside, and if there isn't, then it's false. But if I add negation, I say it is not raining. Well, now it'll be true if there's no rain outside, and it's false if there is. So it just took that original proposition and it flipped the truth values. What was true is now false. What was false is now true. If-then statements are a little trickier. Here again we have two propositions, the same way we did for and or. But we're going to evaluate it very differently. For an if-then statement, if the first half is true, then the second also has to be true. If we don't meet that condition, then the whole thing is going to be false. The reason this is a little weird is you can have the first one be false and the second one true, and that's okay. You can have the first one be false and the second one false, and that's okay. You can have both of them be true, and that's okay. The only time when it's false is if the first one is true and the second one is false. Bit weird. We'll see some examples of this to see it in action. And then the last one is if and only if. So it's like if then, but with a tweak. And the tweak is that both propositions have to be the same, either both true or both false. So if both arguments are false, then the whole thing is true. Both arguments are true, the whole thing is true. If one is true and one is false, then the whole thing becomes false. Okay, I don't know if this makes very much sense. It's probably a lot easier if we think of an example. And for this lecture, I really want to focus on if-then statements. That's what I'm interested in. How do people evaluate if-then statements? So to see what an if-then statement really is and how it works, I think it'd be really helpful to have an example. So let's picture this scenario. Let's suppose a Jedi, and I'll just make up a name. I'll call him, I don't know, Anakin Skywalker. Anakin Skywalker has just been placed on the Jedi Council. All the other Jedi Council members are Jedi Masters. So our Jedi, Anakin Skywalker, assumes this logical expression. He assumes, if you are on the Jedi Council, then you are a Jedi Master. Let's evaluate this expression. If you are on the Jedi Council, then you are a Jedi Master. Under which conditions will this be true, and under which conditions will this be false? Well, right away, I think we can acknowledge that there are probably a lot of Jedi Masters that are not on the Council, right? Think of Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon Jinn was a Jedi Master, but he was kind of a renegade. He was not a member of the Council. I don't think they liked him very much. The two things are not necessarily dependent on each other. You can be a Jedi Master and not be on the Jedi Council. That's fine. It's only a small select group of Jedi Masters who are on the Council. So the second part can be true, Qui-Gon Jinn is a Jedi Master. And the first part can be false, he's not on the Council. And yet the whole thing is still true. So we haven't invalidated this if-then statement. It's still true that if you're on the Jedi Council that you should be a Jedi Master. The existence of Qui-Gon Jinn being a Jedi Master not on the Council doesn't invalidate that. Okay, well, we also know that there are a lot of Jedi that are not Jedi Masters and also are not on the Council. That, again, I think is probably pretty obvious. That doesn't invalidate this either. You have all those Jedi Padawans. They're obviously not Jedi Masters, and they're also not on the Council. Cool. So both parts can be false. A Padawan is both not on the Council and not a Jedi Master. Doesn't invalidate our if-then statement. And of course, the Jedi Council has a lot of Jedi Masters on it, right? Like Yoda and Mace Windu. They are both Jedi Masters and they are on the Council. So that would be a case where both parts are true. They're on the Council and they're Jedi Masters. All right, now let's think about our boy Anakin.
You are on this council, but we do not grant you the rank of Master.
What? How can you do this? This is outrageous. It's unfair. How can you be on the Council and not be a Master?
Take a seat, young Skywalker.
He's on the Jedi Council, but he has not been granted the rank of Master. This is a problem for our logical proposition. So our expression, if you are on the Jedi Council, then you are a Jedi Master, it is false in this context. It cannot be true that if you are on the Jedi Council, then you are a Jedi Master, because Anakin Skywalker is now counter evidence against that. He is not a Jedi Master, yet he is on the Council. So it can't possibly be the case that if you're on the Council, then you are a Master. This example invalidates our logical expression. Another way of thinking about it is our logical expression is incompatible with this fact, with Anakin Skywalker being on the Council and not being a Jedi Master. So this is the only case in which this if-then can be false. If the first part is true, you're on the Jedi Council, but the second part is false, you are not a Jedi Master. And that's if-then statements in a nutshell. It's going to be true unless the first part is true and the second part is false. That is the only circumstance under which that logical expression, that if-then expression, will be false. Is it a little unintuitive? If-then statements are a little bit weird. The question is, how good are we at evaluating if-then conditionals in the wild, in our day-to-day lives? Let's run through a little scenario. Imagine I hire you as a clerk. I'm going to give you a stack of documents, and your job is to make sure that the documents are marked correctly according to this rule. If a document has an E rating, then it must be marked code 4. And in this scenario, you're going to see that E rating on one side of the document, and you're going to see the numerical code on the other side. So you might have to flip a document over to see if it follows the rule or if it violates the rule. So far, so good? What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a series of documents, and I just want you to think about which of these you would have to flip over to tell if the rule is being followed or if the rule is being violated. So we have a document with an E rating, we have a document with a G rating, we have a document marked 4, and we have a document marked 8. Which of these do we need to flip over to determine if it's following the rule? Now, of course, we could just flip all of them over and check everything, but you don't want to waste a bunch of time, right? We want to be efficient about this. So which are the only ones that are necessary to flip over to see if they're following the rule? And which ones do you not need to flip over? Well, we're going to need to flip over the document with the E rating, right? We have a rule that says that if it has an E rating, then it has to have code 4. Here we have one that has an E rating. It's pretty clear, I think, that we need to flip this over to see if it's marked with code 4. And if it's not, we're going to have a problem. What about the document marked G? Well, that's not really part of our rule, right? We don't really care about documents marked G. We only care about documents marked E. So if we flip this over and we find a 4, it doesn't really matter. If we flip it over and we find something other than a 4, it also doesn't matter. We don't have any rule that governs G's. So I think we probably all agree that this doesn't need to get flipped over. What about the document marked 4? Do we need to flip it over to see if it has an E rating? This might seem a little bit weird and unintuitive. We actually don't need to flip this one. If you flip it and you find an E, fine, it follows the rule. If you flip it and you find it doesn't have an E, does it violate the rule? The answer is no. The only thing we care about, the only scenario that we care about is if there's an E on one side and anything other than a 4 on the other side. So of course we need to flip over that last one, the 8, because it doesn't have a 4. It may seem a little weird, but that's exactly the one that we need to explore, because if it turns out to have an E on the other side, then we're in trouble. E has to have a 4. This test is called the Wason selection task. It's meant to elucidate how good we are at evaluating logical propositions. How well do we understand what an if-then statement really means? If you had the wrong intuition here, I don't think you should feel bad. When this was first shown to me, I got the wrong answer, and I felt very strongly about it. I've shown this to many, many people, and it is very common to get this intuition, to evaluate this conditional in this way. The question is why? Why is that? Why are we so bad at evaluating the conditional in this case? Well, let's try another example. Let's do a different scenario. Suppose you're volunteering at a fundraiser dinner. Guests at this dinner bought different tickets for different meals. And you've been asked to check the seating arrangement and make sure that everyone is getting the right kind of meal according to this rule. If a person is eating lobster, then they must have a red wristband. So let's suppose you see someone eating lobster, you see someone eating a salad, you see someone with a green wristband, you see someone with a red wristband. Some of these people you're going to have to investigate to see what color wristband they have. Some of them you'll have to investigate to see what they're eating. Question is, who do you need to investigate and who do you not need to investigate? Now again, I think we're going to have very strong intuitions about this. But in this case, I think we're much more likely to have the right intuitions. We're going to have to investigate the person eating the lobster. This is the case that I think is most applicable to the rule. If a person is eating lobster, then they must have a red wristband. We got to check the person eating the lobster to see if they have a red wristband. If they don't, that's a problem. They're getting a free meal. Do we need to check the person eating the salad? No, we don't really care about the person eating the salad. We don't care if somebody bought a lobster ticket and then ate the much cheaper salad. We only really care if someone bought a salad ticket and now is eating a much more expensive lobster. So I don't really care what color wristband the salad eater has. It doesn't matter. Do I need to check the green wristband? Yes. We need to check the person who only paid for a salad meal to make sure they're not eating lobster. And similarly, we don't need to check the red wristband. I don't really care. Once you buy the expensive meal, I don't particularly care if you're going to eat a cheaper one. So this is a case where I think our accuracy at evaluating the conditional increases a lot. And this is going to feel, I think, a lot more intuitive to most of us. The question is why? Why does this feel more intuitive? I have pretty good reason to believe that you've never been in either of these scenarios. These two scenarios should be equally unfamiliar. They do represent the sort of thing that might happen in the society that we live in. You might go to a fundraiser dinner, you might have to file documents with specific ratings and markings, but it's unlikely that you've ever encountered these specific rules. Why is one of them so much more intuitive and easier to solve than the other? What's the difference between these two scenarios? Well, maybe we can easily identify someone wearing a green wristband as a potential cheater, and we have to check them to see if they are cheating. In that previous example, we didn't really personify the number 8. We didn't think of the cards with that 8 marking as being potential cheaters. We didn't think of them as like cheating the rule. But when we put ourselves into the shoes of someone who is policing a social event, where people paid for tickets to eat meals, suddenly it becomes a lot clearer what we're supposed to investigate. Because suddenly it involves cheating. It involves a social rule. It turns out that human beings are really good at detecting cheaters. So now the question is, why should that be the case? Why are we so good at detecting cheating? According to social contract theory, social contracts relate perceived benefits to perceived costs. An individual has to pay some kind of cost to be eligible for some kind of benefit. You have to pay the lobster ticket to get the lobster meal. And accepting that benefit without paying the cost is cheating. Right? If you paid for a salad ticket but you eat a lobster, you're a cheater. You didn't pay for that meal. The question is why we should care so much about this. And what helps, I think, is if we think about this in an evolutionary context. In an environment where we depend on each other for survival, cooperation is really key. Humans are very social animals. It is a very important and integral part of our evolutionary story. We have relied on each other. We have relied on cooperation as a tool for our survival. And in that context where we're relying on each other and we are relying on cooperation in order to survive, cheating can't be tolerated. If too many people are cheating, then not enough people are doing the work and the whole system fails. Our social unit won't be able to function effectively in that environment and we may not survive. So the theory here is that evolution equipped us with some kind of special cheater detection module. It's like a very specific piece of computational machinery in our minds that evolved with a very specific purpose: to detect cheaters. So let's cycle back to our original question. How good are humans at logical reasoning? Well, maybe we're not that good in general, but we get real good if it's tied to some kind of social rule violation. We get really good at evaluating logical propositions if it activates our cheater detection module. One thing that we might want to do is disentangle rules in general from social contracts specifically. Because cheater detection only seems to work when we can imagine that we are being cheated. This is why we have such a hard time with that document rating scenario and a much easier time with the fundraising dinner scenario. Because we can imagine that we are being cheated. But still, we need to test this. Maybe we're good at certain scenarios and not others just because of availability or familiarity. I tried to pick things that I thought you wouldn't have ever experienced in particular, but maybe there's enough similarity because you've been in similar situations, like having eaten at a restaurant or had to grade papers. Well, what if we introduce really unfamiliar rules? Rules from other cultures that we don't have a lot of experience with? Well, this is something that has been tested. We can take a rule like, if a man eats cassava root, then he must have a tattoo on his face. I can't speak for all of us, but I think it's probable that most of us have probably never lived in a culture that has this particular rule. Or what about this one? If you eat diker meat, then you have found an ostrich eggshell. And if you don't know what a diker is, it's kind of like a small deer that lives in Africa. This is pretty unfamiliar, at least to me. I've never eaten diker meat or found ostrich eggshells. I don't live in a place where those things even exist. So how good are we at evaluating these kinds of propositions? Well, Gigerenzer and Hug have tested this pretty extensively, and what they've found is that this conforms exactly to what we would expect if we believe there is such a thing as a cheater detection module, if our reasoning is constrained by social contracts. So in this case, even though we are very unfamiliar with these rules, we are still going to be much better at evaluating these rules than we are at rules that are more abstract. What matters isn't familiarity. What matters is whether we can imagine being in that situation and whether in that situation we can think of someone as cheating. What matters is if there is a social contract in place, even if it's a social contract that is completely novel and unfamiliar to us. Let's think about this one more way. Let's think about social contracts and perspective. So we can see that part of what makes us good at this is that we can put ourselves into the position of someone in this culture, that we can imagine having to follow this rule, and we can imagine being cheated. This type of reasoning seems to only work if we can imagine that we are ourselves in some way being cheated. Well, it turns out that the perspective that we take can really affect how we choose to evaluate these kinds of propositions. So let's think about another scenario. Let's suppose that we work for a company that has the following rule. If an employee works on the weekend, then that person gets a day off during the week. Pretty simple rule. If you work on the weekend, then you get a day off during the week. Seems fair. But what does the employee care about? What does the employer care about? Do they care about the same things? Suppose I show you 4 employees. One employee worked on the weekend, one got a day off during the week, one didn't work on the weekend, and another didn't get a day off during the week. So if you need to evaluate and see if this rule was followed, which of these employees do you need to follow up and check on? Your answer here may depend on which perspective you are taking. Remember that we activate our cheater detection module if we can imagine ourselves being cheated. So here it really matters whether you're taking the perspective of the employee. Do I imagine myself being cheated as an employee? Or whether I take the perspective of the employer. Do I imagine myself being cheated as the employer? If I'm an employee, then I'm going to want to check on the employee who worked on the weekend. I have to make sure that you got your day off. As an employee, that's what I care about. I care about my fellow workers not being exploited. I want to make sure that if you worked on the weekend, that you got your day off during the week. I'm also going to have to check on the employee who didn't get a day off. I have to make sure that you didn't work on the weekend. Otherwise, that would be extremely unfair. That would constitute our employer cheating you. If I take the perspective of the employer, suddenly my perspective is very different. My values are very different. Here I don't care necessarily if workers wind up working for free. I care if they take a day off that they weren't supposed to. So if I'm taking the perspective of the employer, I'm going to want to check the person who got the day off during the week and make sure that they worked on the weekend to earn that day off. I'm also going to want to check on the person that didn't work on the weekend and make sure they don't take an extra day off during the week, because that's not something that they earned. So the way that we evaluate this depends very strongly on which perspective we are taking. And the reason that that matters, it matters because we can only evaluate this effectively if we can imagine ourselves being cheated. So what this shows us is it shows us that we really care about being cheated. We really care about cheaters. And our ability to reason is highly motivated. It's not the case that everything about our decision-making processes is boundedly rational. It's not the case that we can explain everything we do just in terms of what will give us the best outcome for the least effort. There are some scenarios where our rationality is highly dependent on very specific social factors. Here, our ability to reason is highly motivated by our desire to not be cheated and our desire to not tolerate cheating. Now, we can think of this as being somewhat rational in an evolutionary context when our survival absolutely depended on cooperation between actors and the absence of cheating. Maybe we can have a discussion about how rational it still is. Maybe it's rational to have a certain amount of tolerance for cheating. Maybe we're spending a little bit too much effort pursuing and punishing cheaters. At a certain point, that may become irrational to spend more resources investigating cheating than we are spending cooperating with each other. Okay, this was a pretty brief lecture. I just want to go over the key concepts real quick. We talked about logic, that having different logical operators that operate over different propositions to get us truth values. Logic is all about validity. And I really want to talk about logic in the context of human rationality. How logical are human beings? How good are we at evaluating these kinds of logical propositions? And one way we can test this is with the Wason selection task, by testing how we evaluate if-then conditional statements and modulating whether they are social or non-social. This ties into social contract theory. The idea that some of our relationships are transactional, that we may pay some cost to receive some kind of benefit. And we are very intolerant of cheaters in our social contracts. So we are highly motivated to reason in such a way that we can detect cheating. Turns out we are much, much better at evaluating these kinds of logical propositions if we can imagine ourselves being cheated. And otherwise, we are kind of not that good. So how logical are human beings? It may depend on social context.